Mohammed Altajer, President of Lawyers for Human Rights in Bahrain. We're 5 years on from the initial protests in Bahrain. What has happened since then?
More resistance from the people, more demands. The protesters 5 years back were asking for change, for their rights to choose their government. I think now the situation after that much of violation and atrocities committed, I think that they have raised their voices demanding maybe something larger than changing the government. A lot of demands has been ratified because they can't see that with this government or reshuffling the ministers might help. Now they need a share of power. They need their rights to govern their country, to live peacefully, and actually more people are ready to sacrifice because there are rights which were violated, and there are total denial that there is a major problem in Bahrain. That's why we think that our crisis has become a regional problem where most powerful players in the Gulf are trying to have a solution for what's going on in Bahrain.
The detainees, there are almost 2,000 detainees, is that correct? 2,500. And would you say that they were from a violent protest movement?
Only, as my assessment, I can't find even more than 5% who has turned to violence. And I'm not giving excuses for them, but I remember 3 years back telling the international players in Bahrain case that leaving and abandoning Bahrainis who are being killed in the street just for protesting. I was telling them that we are afraid that there are people who will turn to violence. Now, there are a lot of people who believe that they can't change the government unless they use the violence. And even the American has said that the problem in Bahrain, that Bahrainis can't change their government by the peaceful means.
And what would you like the EU to do?
I'd like the EU to be more engaged in Bahrain, as it is very crucial area, and I would like the EU to take more responsibilities in monitoring trials and interference to stop the violations, and more pressure that Bahrain stick to its international commitment, especially that it is rectifying major international treaties, and it is a Human Rights Council member, where I think the human rights values are so precious and important, and I'd like equal standards for the Bahrainis and for the Europeans.
Julie Ward MEP, you're here today to talk about Bahrain. What is your involvement with Bahrain?
Well, I'm very concerned about human rights being a foundation for all the work that we do, because I think when we disregard human rights, then we don't have then we lose our legitimacy, actually. And I think that we must bring human rights into all the work that we do. So I've been very concerned about freedom of speech, and so when I was first elected, I became very involved in the case of Nabil Rajab, and took the Parliament through a process of having a debate and a resolution which enabled, which actually had him released. So, you know, it's quite a complex process, and you have to persuade your colleagues that this is a really urgent case, that it's because there are many urgent cases of human rights abuses around the world. But so you have to work really hard. You have to have good information. You have to have fantastic relationships with the organisations from the countries who are documenting the abuses and can give you the right information. You have to have great staff that can really support you. And I do this outside of my committee work, so it's like another thing that I do. But for me, if we can't get this right, then we'll get nothing right.
And there are thousands of detainees in Bahrain. Would you like to see further action from the European Parliament and indeed the EU?
Yes, I would. We can pick up individual cases, and when things are very urgent, for example, Mohammed Ramadan's sentence is very urgent and frightening for all of us, and an outrage, actually, particularly because we just passed a resolution in the Parliament before Christmas condemning the use of the death penalty. So, you know, we've said it again ourselves for our member states, but we actually condemn that, you know, universally, globally. So I think it's really important that we do have further action. And I was glad that the resolution that we passed in January for Mohammed Ramadan was able also to refer back to the case of Nabil, was able to expose and regret and condemn the fact that Bahrain hadn't made enough progress on other things that it had promised to do. So it does give us an opportunity to take a wider view when we take an individual case.
And you've spoken recently with the ambassador for Bahrain. Did you get any positive feedback on what the authorities in Bahrain themselves will be doing to meet your concerns?
Well, the response to my concern about the death penalty served on Mohammed Ramadan was basically dismissed with a, well, we never, you know, we might sentence somebody, but we hardly ever carry it out. Well, that's not good enough for me, you know, and that's a very awful situation for somebody to be in, particularly if they're innocent. You know, and we don't want the death penalty for people who are convicted of heinous crimes. You know, we have a real problem in knowing whether or not, you know, all sorts of cases back in the UK have been overturned. So, you know, how do we know if we take a life? Maybe 30 years down the line, we made the wrong decision. So for me, that was a terrible answer, because it's not good enough to say, well, we have it, but we don't use it. Actually, don't have it. You know, that for me, that's really important. So I found that a very glib answer, and that wasn't a good way for her to begin her conversation with me, just to laugh it off. Then there were all basically every, you know, I had cases, I had 7 individual cases in my hand, which Amnesty International have gathered evidence on. So, and this information is available globally, and there's a mass movement that Amnesty International supporters participate in, signing petitions and putting pressure on governments who are oppressing their citizens. So I'm not one individual person speaking about this. I'm part of a movement of people. So to have a kind of excuse or a response, or somebody saying, oh, well, we don't really do this, when actually we have organisations who are dedicated to exposing human rights abuses. They've been doing it a long time. They have a fantastic track record. So, excuses are not, you know, or trying to deflect. I mean, that's the other thing, is deflecting it and saying, well, why are you looking at us? Why aren't you looking at Iran? Well, I'm looking at it all, you know, whether it's in Bahrain, whether it's in Saudi, whether it's in Iran. These are all human rights abuses, and it's not an either or. It's sort it all out.
Gaëlle Dusepulchre, you're in Brussels today, talk about the situation in Bahrain in particular. What would you like to see the EU doing?
Yes, so we've tried here to make the point finally on the situation in Bahrain regarding human rights since the last 5 years. And how finally the EU can use all its leverage to try to push to improve the situation on the ground, on the serious violations that are occurring now on a daily basis. And finally, what we expect is really difficult. We would like that the institution continues to work on Bahrain, like the European Parliament that is monitoring the situation very closely and making really useful recommendation to the government of Bahrain, but also to the EU institutions. We really need to make the follow-up of that, to try to be sure that those recommendations are not piece of paper, but are finally implemented on the ground. In the short term, what we would like to see, perhaps it is a strong position of the EU and a coherent position of the EU regarding its relation with Bahrain. So raising more constitutionally, more continuously, finally, the situation on the ground, the situation of human rights defender, torture, and all those kind of things happening today in Bahrain. Second thing, it is to really try to institutionalize that dialogue with a direct implication of the civil society to legitimate finally the daily fight of the civil society to improve the situation in Bahrain, and more coherence also when the EU is making trade with countries that are violating on a daily basis human rights, selling arms, and cooperating in serious issues like counter-terrorism. Because in Bahrain also there is some abuse of those kind of law to repress freedom of expression and association, and the EU has to cooperate in a clever manner on those kind of topics.
The EU, of course, is taking additional measures to combat terrorism. They've maybe welcome anti-terrorism laws. Should we be welcoming this type of legislation in countries like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain?
The real issue is how concrete are those laws, to be sure that they tackle the only issue of terrorism and no the issue of opposition, political opposition in the country, or the simple use of human rights in the country, like freedom of expression and association. I think that we are facing here in Europe the same problems, to be sure that the right balance is ensured between security and human rights. And I'm sure that the EU can be clever in that kind of relation and the cooperation on this issue also with foreign countries on this topic.